Tonight, you're not chasing better habits or counting how many hours you should be sleeping. Tonight, you're re-stepping into a palace that is so quiet it can make danger feel polite. Close enough to hear a lacquer box click without meaning to. Close enough to notice how a jade cup can land on wood without asking the room for permission. Before you drift off, you'll watch how time inside the court is treated like an appointment morning audiences. Sealed memorials, footsteps measured on stone, because when everything is ritual, you can pretend you're in control of what changes. You'll meet the soft-spoken sellers of forever alchemists and adepts who bring diagrams, furnace language, and sweet medicine that goes down easily. And you'll feel the quiet trap forming. When the promise is immortality, stopping doesn't feel like caution. It feels like choosing mortality on purpose. 3 small senses to keep you company. A lacquer box clicking once, like a secret closing its mouth. Incense thinning into silk air, turning the room into a slow, breathing cloud. And a cup that makes no sound on wood, as if silence itself has been trained. If your breathing starts to follow that rhythm, let it. Inhale 4, exhale 6. If you like stories that stay calm while they reveal something unsettling, soft history, quiet power, and the human fear underneath it, consider subscribing. Only if you want more nights like this. And tell me, where and what time are you listening from? I'll imagine that jade cup landing there too, silent and careful, in your corner of the night. Because tonight's story doesn't begin with a battle. It begins with a promise that tastes sweet, and a court that wants forever badly enough to swallow it. A lacquer box clicks, softly as if it's trying not to wake the room. Incense thins into silk air and drifts the way a thought drifts when you stop chasing it. A jade cup makes no sound on wood, because the palace is trained in quiet, and quiet is one of its favorite tricks. In palace life, time is not something you merely have. It is something you schedule. It arrives in a sequence of small ceremonies, and then it leaves again, politely, like a court official backing out of a room. The morning audience has its hour. The sealing of memorials has its hour. The changing of robes, the rinsing of hands, the measured steps across stone that has been polished by centuries of other measured steps, all of it has its hour. Even the air seems to know the timetable. It smells different at different moments. Early incense is sharper, like waking up. Late incense is sweeter, like surrender. Somewhere, a water clock is dripping with patient confidence, and a keeper is glancing at it with the same calm seriousness you might reserve for checking whether your kettle is boiling. Over there, a drum tower or bell tower sends a sound into the courtyards. Not loud, not theatrical, just firm enough to remind everyone that time is doing what it always does. And the palace responds by pretending it can keep up. Because behind all that order sits a private fear that the palace does not like to name too loudly, not in public, not in a hall of painted beams and carved brackets, and the faint sheen of lacquer catching lamplight. The fear is ordinary, which is part of why it's so embarrassing. The fear is that bodies get tired, teeth loosen, knees ache, breath shortens. And even emperors, especially emperors, if we're being honest, eventually leave the room. So the word longevity becomes more than a wish. It becomes a kind of daily policy, a decorative obsession dressed as wisdom, something respectable enough to discuss in formal language, and flexible enough to hide panic inside it. It's not, in this world, a single dramatic desire to live forever like a mythic hero. It's more like an appointment book that never ends, a routine, a quiet administrative project with a very large emotional budget. If you were wandering these corridors slowly, gently, the way you might wander through a museum when you retrying not to disturb anyone, you do notice how many small practices are aimed at one simple goal: make time behave. The body becomes a territory to be managed, like a province. You regulate sleep. You regulate food. You regulate the temperature of bathwater, the thickness of clothing, the number of layers between skin and wind. People speak of nourishing life, and it sounds very serene, very philosophical, and it can be in its softer versions. But in the palace, it also becomes a technology of control, because control is what power knows how to do. There are physicians, of course, and they are not merely healers. They're also interpreters. They interpret the body the way officials interpret omens, with careful phrasing and a deep understanding of what can be safely said aloud. They take pulses with a patience that feels almost theatrical, because the pulse is a tiny drum that cannot lie, and yet everyone around it is trying gently to negotiate with truth. A physician's fingertips rest at the wrist, and in those fingertips the whole court holds its breath, as though listening for a verdict. The Emperor's Day can include breathing exercises that are described as cultivation, slow and deliberate, like polishing a piece of jade. There can be quiet walks timed to seasons, because the body is supposed to move with spring and rest with winter. And the calendar in this world is not just a calendar. It is an instruction manual for being alive. There can be dietary rules that sound almost soothing in their specificity. Warm foods in certain weather, cooling foods in other weather, broths that promise to strengthen the center, teas that promise to calm the spirit. It all has the pleasant, faintly boring feeling of someone telling you the correct way to store rice, so it doesn't spoil. And that boring feeling is part of the charm. Boring is safe. Boring is stable. Boring suggests that nothing dramatic is happening, which is exactly what an aging ruler wants to believe. Because if immortality were a single, outrageous leap, it would be easy to doubt it. But if immortality is presented as a series of small, respectable steps today, you take this tonic tomorrow, you avoid that wind. Next week, you adjust your schedule. Next month, you consult a specialist. Then it starts to feel like normal life. Like upkeep, like the palace's version of changing the oil. The court has a particular talent for turning dread into etiquette. If you fear death, you don't call it fear. You call it refinement. You call it self-cultivation. You call it concern for the harmony of the realm. And you frame it as responsibility, because responsibility is a very elegant disguise. A ruler must live long, after all, because the ruler must govern. The people need stability. The ancestors expect continuity. Heaven appreciates good administration. Longevity in this logic becomes almost civic-minded, a public service performed by a private body. There's also hierarchy embedded in the very idea of living longer. Not everyone is allowed to dream equally. A peasant grows old if the harvest permits it. A soldier grows old if the battlefield forgets his name. But a ruler grows old surrounded by specialists, attendants, prescriptions, and theories. In a palace, even aging is staffed. Even anxiety has a support team. If you want to live forever, you can assign someone to research it, someone to procure ingredients, someone to write reports about it, and someone to stand very still while you decide whether the report sounds convincing. And so immortality becomes a daily appointment, the way you might schedule a meeting you can't quite admit you're nervous about. It sits there on the calendar, waiting, not always explicitly written as defeat death, because that would look a bit desperate. It's written as health regimen, seasonal adjustment, nourishing practices, consultation. The words are gentle. The meaning is enormous. You can imagine the paperwork too. Bamboo slips or paper sheets carrying careful lines of ink, lists of ingredients, lists of precautions, lists of auspicious days when certain practices are more effective, because even the universe apparently has office hours. A recommendation might arrive wrapped in formality, delivered with a bow, phrased so that it sounds like it's about balance rather than fear. The palace loves balance. Balance is what you say when you don't want to say you're frightened. Somewhere in this gentle machinery, the idea begins to harden into a belief. Longer life is not just something you hope for. It is something you can purchase, refine, and control. A kind of statcraft applied inward. You manage borders. You manage officials. You manage grain. Why wouldn't you manage mortality too, with the same confident, paper-heavy logic? If you're listening in a dark room, you might notice how quietly absurd that confidence is, and how soothing it can sound anyway. Because the palace tone is always calm, even when it's asking for impossible things. Even when it's bargaining with the one law that has never taken bribes. So the day continues, more incense, more footsteps, more polished rituals, a little more attention to the body, as if attention itself could act like a shield. And in that steady rhythm measured, repeatable, dignified immortality stops being a wild dream and becomes something far more persuasive. It becomes routine. And routine, as the palace knows very well, is how you make almost anything feel normal. They arrive the way delicate things arrive in a place that likes delicate things. Not with a parade, not with a shout, not with any suggestion that they are trying to impress you. They arrive as if they are already expected, as if the palace has simply been waiting to remember them. A calm voice at the threshold, a careful bow, hands that move slowly, because fast hands look like hands that might spill something. They do not call themselves miracle sellers, at least not in the palace. They do not say, "I will make you immortal," because that is an unrefined sentence. Instead, they speak in the language of harmony and method. They speak of balance. They speak of breath and essence and the way the body is supposed to behave when it is treated with the correct kind of respect. They speak as if the problem is not death, exactly, but misalignment. As if mortality is simply what happens when you let the paperwork of the cosmos pile up on your desk. These are Taoist adepts, court specialists, and alchemists, whose job description is always slightly soft around the edges. They are half scholar, half technician, half storyteller, which is already too many halves, but the palace does not mind contradictions as long as they are politely phrased. Their confidence is gentle. Their certainty is dressed in quietness. They do not argue. They do not push. They simply explain, and the explaining itself feels like a kind of proof. They bring diagrams. Not flamboyant diagrams, not anything that looks like a child's drawing of a dragon. These are the neat diagrams of someone who wants to sound responsible. Small circles, lines that connect things that may or may not be connectable. Labels that suggest the universe has compartments. Sometimes the diagrams are of the body, described like a landscape with gates and reservoirs and routes that must be kept clear. Sometimes they are of furnaces and vessels, described like a miniature administration with rules and timing and a very strict sense of what is allowed to touch what. And they bring language too. Furnace language, it might be called, the vocabulary of heat and transformation and refining. It sounds practical. It sounds almost boring, which is perfect. Boring is the palace's favorite disguise for danger. If something is boring enough, it feels safe enough to try. If something is described with enough procedure, it feels less like a gamble and more like a craft. They speak of ingredients the way a patient person speaks of pantry items. Minerals with names that sound respectable. Salts and stones and powders, ground until they are as fine as a sigh. Things taken from mountains because mountains feel older than people and therefore feel like they might know something. Things taken from deep earth because deep earth feels like secrecy. Herbs that have been used for a long time, which is a phrase that the palace finds comforting because a long time sounds like evidence even when it is mostly habit. The palace listens. The palace always listens when someone offers a method. A method is a promise that the world is predictable. A method says, if you do A, B will follow, and if B follows, perhaps C will arrive, quietly, without anyone having to beg for it. And the men who sell heaven in a bowl understand something fundamental about hierarchy. Power does not like to admit it is powerless. A ruler can command 1,000 people to kneel, but cannot command his own bones to stop aging. A ruler can send armies across borders, but cannot send time away. This mismatch creates a kind of private humiliation, and humiliation is a surprisingly expensive fuel. It burns cleanly. It burns for a long time. It will pay for almost anything that claims to solve it. So the adepts come with calm voices and careful hands, speaking of hidden methods that are not hidden in the sense of being forbidden, but hidden in the sense of being exclusive. Hidden like the back room of a shop where the real goods are kept. Hidden like the inner chamber where only certain people are allowed to step. The palace loves anything that feels like an inner chamber. They offer harmonies. Not only musical harmonies, though the words often drift in that direction, but harmonies between elements, between seasons, between the body and the sky. They describe the human being as a small version of the cosmos, which is flattering, and flattery goes down easily in a place built on flattery. They describe the body as a vessel that can be strengthened, sealed, refined, and made less leaky. This is a polite way of saying what everyone already knows. Life drips away. They simply promise a better seal. Sometimes, to make the seal sound plausible, they talk about metals. Metals are persuasive because metals endure. They do not rot. They do not wrinkle. They do not complain about the weather. Gold is the palace's favorite metal, not only because it is beautiful, but because it seems to ignore time's usual behavior. It sits there shining as if it has never heard of decay. So the idea of taking something metal-like into the body becomes strangely seductive. If gold survives, perhaps something gold-adjacent can teach the body to survive. If cinnabar glows with that peculiar red, perhaps that glow is a kind of vitality you can borrow. If a mineral can be heated and transformed, perhaps the body can be heated and transformed too, with enough patience and enough skill. The alchemist's pitch is often not loud, but it is thorough. It is made of details. And details are persuasive in the way a long instruction manual is persuasive. A long instruction manual implies that someone has tried this before. It implies that mistakes have been made and corrected. It implies that the outcome can be guided, not just hoped for. They talk about timing. Timing matters, they say, because timing always matters in ritual, and the palace is already trained to believe in timing. You do not hold an audience at midnight. You do not offer certain sacrifices on the wrong day. You do not change certain arrangements when the wind is in the wrong direction. The palace is a machine that runs on appropriate moments. So when the alchemist says, "Take this at the correct hour," it feels natural, like adding another appointment to a schedule that already pretends to manage the universe. They talk about temperature. Heat must be controlled. The furnace must not be too fierce, not too weak. The fire must be fed, then restrained. This sounds like governance. This sounds like the management of officials. This sounds like something the court already knows how to do. Apply pressure, then soften it, then apply it again, until the desired shape appears. They talk about purity. Ingredients must be chosen carefully, cleaned carefully, combined carefully. Purity is a palace obsession in general. Purity in food. Purity in lineage. Purity in ritual vessels. Purity in the wording of a memorial. Purity in the way you hold your posture when you speak. So purity in medicine fits easily into the palace's existing habits. It feels less like a new idea and more like a continuation of the same old, tidy superstition that says, if everything is clean enough, nothing bad will dare to enter. And then, very softly, they offer the most persuasive thing of all, an explanation that turns fear into wisdom. They do not say the ruler is afraid to die. They say the ruler is wisely seeking longevity. They do not say the ruler is desperate. They say the ruler is disciplined. They do not say the ruler is trying to escape nature. They say the ruler is learning how to cooperate with nature's deeper patterns. This is a beautiful trick, and the palace loves beautiful tricks. The men themselves are part of the performance. They dress appropriately. They speak appropriately. They use the correct honorifics. They do not challenge the hierarchy. They reinforce it. They imply gently that the ruler is the kind of person who deserves a longer life, that the heavens are not indifferent. The heavens are simply waiting to see if the ruler is refined enough to receive the right knowledge. And because the palace is built on the idea that refinement earns privilege, this implication lands smoothly. If privilege exists in court life, why would it not exist in the length of one's days? If there are inner gates and outer gates, if there are inner chambers and outer chambers, why would there not be inner lifespans and outer lifespans? For an elite mind trained in gradations, immortality is not an outrageous idea. It is simply the ultimate gradation. The alchemists also know how to make their work look less like magic and more like craftsmanship. They do not wave hands dramatically. They measure. They seal jars. They label. They write instructions as if writing etiquette. In fact, the instructions can feel like etiquette. Do not speak loudly near the preparation. Do not allow impure air. Do not allow careless hands. Do not allow certain foods at certain times. Do not allow certain emotions, if possible, because emotions are messy. The palace loves rules that make the world feel less messy. There is a quiet comedy in this, if you like gentle comedies. Imagine someone telling a ruler who can command armies that the success of a longevity pill depends on whether the room was kept calm. Imagine an attendant nodding solemnly at the concept of calm room management. Imagine a court official treating the mood of the furnace as a matter of national interest. It sounds absurd, but the palace is a place where absurdity can become solemn simply by being written down, and written down it is. The court collects methods the way it collects poems and records and porcelain. It stores them. It catalogs them. It refers to them with a respectful tone. When a method fails, the failure is rarely described as failure. It is described as an adjustment. The dosage was not correct. The timing was not auspicious. The ingredients were not pure enough. The fire was too strong or too weak or offended by the weather. There is always a reason that preserves the method's dignity. Preserving dignity is important because dignity is how belief survives. The men who sell heaven in a bowl do not need to be perfect. They only need to be plausible. And plausibility in the palace is built from ritual. So they lean into ritual. They let the preparation of an elixir feel like a ceremony. The powders are measured slowly. The jars are sealed carefully. The vessels are cleaned as if they are sacred. The process becomes something the ruler can watch and feel involved in because watching is comforting. Watching creates the illusion of control. If you can watch a thing being made, it feels less like a mysterious risk and more like a project you have supervised. This is why they bring not only ingredients, but also theater, quietly disguised as procedure. The palace is already full of theater, of course bows, choreographed movements, controlled silence. The alchemists simply add another performance to the list. A performance whose message is, we know what we are doing. And the palace, which is exhausted by uncertainty, wants very badly to hear those words. There is also the matter of secrecy, which is handled with a soft touch. The alchemists do not need absolute secrecy. They need selective access. They need to be the ones who know the recipe. The recipe is power. The recipe is proximity. The recipe is a ticket into the ruler's private fear. If you can enter the fear, you can become indispensable. So the recipe is described as ancient, or rare, or transmitted through a line of masters who do not teach everyone. The palace finds lineage persuasive. A method with lineage feels safer than a method invented last week. A method with lineage feels like it belongs to the world's natural order, which again makes it feel less like a gamble. The court, in turn, adds bureaucracy to the secrecy. Only certain attendants handle the jars. Only certain cooks prepare the base. Only certain physicians observe the ruler's reaction. Notes are recorded. Reports are sealed. The process becomes institutional, which is the palace's favorite way to make a questionable idea feel legitimate. If an entire office exists to manage something, it starts to feel like something that must be real. Even the language used around the ruler becomes careful. You do not say, "This might be dangerous." You say, "This is potent." You do not say, "This could harm you." You say, "This requires respect." You do not say, "Please stop." You say, "We may refine the regimen." The palace does not like sharp words. Sharp words cut through the pleasant fog of procedure, and the men who sell heaven in a bowl are excellent at maintaining fog. Not confusing fog, just enough fog to soften the edges of reality. They offer a world where power can outlast nature, not by brute force, but by cleverness. The palace loves cleverness because cleverness feels like the natural privilege of the educated and the elite. Cleverness implies that the universe can be negotiated with, if you know the right language. They might speak of immortals, beings who have stepped beyond ordinary time, not as fairy tales, but as examples. Examples are more persuasive than fantasies. An example implies precedent. An example implies that the thing has happened before, and therefore can happen again. They might hint at mountains where recluses cultivate breath until their hair turns dark again, and their steps become light. They might mention sages who survived on dew and moonlight, which is a lovely image, and lovely images are powerful in sleepy spaces. Dew and moonlight sound gentle. They sound like the opposite of violence. They sound like a way of living that does not demand much, which makes it feel morally clean. And moral cleanliness matters because the court wants to believe that its desire to live longer is not greedy. Greed is something you accuse other people of. The court wants to believe it is pursuing longevity for noble reasons, stability, harmony, continuity. The people need a long-lived ruler. The ancestors would approve. Heaven would smile. The empire would remain balanced. This is all very convenient, and convenience is one of the palace's deepest values. Of course, there is an unspoken problem. The palace is built on hierarchy, and hierarchy creates fear of doubt. If everyone around the ruler praises a method, who wants to be the first person to say softly, "What if this is wrong?" That sentence is dangerous, not because it is loud, but because it suggests disloyalty. Challenging the elixir can sound like challenging the ruler's right to hope. And in the palace, hope is a political resource. So when the alchemist speaks, the room participates. The officials nod. The attendants remain perfectly still, which is its own kind of nod. The physicians choose careful phrases. Even skepticism becomes polite. If a physician hesitates, the hesitation is folded into ritual language. We will observe. We will adjust. We will proceed with caution. Caution sounds loyal. Doubt sounds rebellious. The palace prefers caution. The men who sell heaven in a bowl know this. They benefit from it. Their confidence is persuasive because it offers relief, but also because the court environment punishes disbelief. In such a place, belief does some of the work on its own. The method does not need to overpower reality immediately. It only needs to remain protected long enough to become tradition. And tradition, once formed, is very hard to refuse. Imagine a bowl, then. Not a dramatic bowl, just a bowl. Perhaps porcelain, perhaps lacquered, perhaps the kind of object that looks simple until you remember how many hands were involved in making it. In the palace, even bowls can be status symbols. The bowl is placed carefully. The contents are stirred carefully. Someone tastes, perhaps, not to test safety in the modern sense, but to confirm correctness, like checking whether a ceremonial robe is folded the right way. The bowl holds a promise. The promise is sweet in the way sweet things are sweet. It goes down easily. It feels refined. It feels civilized. It feels like something the elite deserve. And that is exactly why it is so difficult to refuse. In a place built on hierarchy, the idea of escaping the final limit does not feel like a reckless fantasy. It feels like the logical conclusion of being powerful. If you have controlled so much, why would you not try to control time itself? If you have lived surrounded by people who obey, why would you not imagine the body might obey as well if given the correct instructions? So the men keep arriving. Calm voices, careful hands, diagrams, furnace language, innocent sounding ingredients. And the palace, always yearning for a method that can be filed and practiced and repeated, keeps listening. Because the dream they offer is not only immortality. The dream is competence. The dream is that the world is still negotiable. The dream is that the ruler's power can reach all the way to the edge of life and gently press the edge back. And in the soft, disciplined hush of palace rooms, where so much is decided in whispers, such a dream can feel, for a moment, almost reasonable. The palace does not like medicine that looks like medicine. It prefers medicine that looks like manners. Something small, something elegant, something that can be presented without admitting, even for a second, that the body is vulnerable and loud and full of opinions. So the sweet medicine arrives with ceremony, because ceremony is how the court makes anything feel trustworthy. A measured powder doesn't just get scooped. It gets weighed, and the weighing is done slowly, as if the scales are listening. A jar doesn't just get closed. It gets sealed, and the seal is pressed with a seriousness usually reserved for official documents, because the palace enjoys the feeling of a stamp making something final. An instruction isn't just advice. It is delivered like etiquette, like a rule for how to stand when you speak, or how to lift a cup without making the cup feel embarrassed. You can picture the preparation room without needing much imagination. It smells faintly of warm wood, dried herbs, and something mineral that is difficult to describe, like the scent you notice near a stone stairwell after rain. The light is controlled. No harsh glare. Just steady lamplight, softened by paper screens. The table is clean in a way that suggests it has been cleaned again. Utensils are arranged as if they are guests at a formal dinner who have been told exactly where to sit. A bowl sits in the center, calm and blank, ready to become important. Someone recites the procedure quietly, not because the words themselves do something magical, but because the palace likes sound to be disciplined. Sound is part of order, and order is part of belief. If you can make the making of a pill feel like a ritual, then the pill begins to feel like a continuation of the palace's normal rhythm, rather than a desperate attempt to bargain with time. There is also always the reassuring presence of numbers. The palace loves numbers. Numbers look impartial. Numbers look sober. Numbers look like they have no emotions, which is very soothing in a building full of emotions that are not allowed to show their faces. So dosage matters, not only in the practical sense, though it does matter practically, but in the emotional sense. Dosage makes the whole affair feel rational. A pinch of this, a fraction of that, a certain number of pellets at a certain hour. The difference between 2 and 3 becomes a kind of moral boundary, as if the universe respects careful counting. And the person who counts becomes powerful because counting is authority in miniature. Timing matters too. Timing always matters in court life. Even meals are scheduled with philosophical confidence. Even sleep has its correct window. The palace is a machine that runs on appropriate moments. So when the medicine is tied to a clock, it feels natural. Morning is for certain tonics. Evening is for certain pellets. Between the two, you avoid certain foods, certain drafts, certain kinds of overthinking. The rules fold neatly into the palace's already crowded list of rules. If you live in a place where the angle of a bow can signal loyalty, then of course the hour you swallow a pellet can signal wisdom. There will be instructions about diet, delivered gently and firmly, the way someone might tell you where to place your shoes in a guest's home. Avoid heavy foods. Avoid overly cold drinks. Do not combine certain ingredients. Do not eat too quickly. Do not eat too late. These rules are not only about the medicine, they are about the feeling of control. The ritual itself sells the illusion of safety. If you follow enough steps, you begin to feel protected by the steps. And the palace loves steps. Steps are visible progress. Steps can be repeated. Steps can be supervised. The pellets themselves are made to be polite. They are not big, not sharp, not challenging. They are small enough to be swallowed without protest, which is important because protest is inconvenient. They may be rolled with honey or bound with something sticky and sweet, because sweetness is not only flavor, sweetness is persuasion. Sweetness says quietly, you are not harming yourself. You are rewarding yourself. Sweetness says, this is refined. Sweetness says, this is a treat, not a risk. Calling a medicine sweet is a masterful piece of court psychology. It turns fear into luxury. It turns an anxious regimen into a habit that feels like privilege. It suggests that the elite are not merely surviving. They are consuming something elegant, something almost fashionable, the way a new silk pattern becomes fashionable, or a new style of cup, or a new way to arrange a room so that the lamplight falls more flatteringly on one's face. In a place where everything is status, even the method of not dying becomes status. So a small pill before bed becomes a routine, then a habit, then a quiet identity. I am someone who takes the correct thing at the correct time. I am someone who follows the method. I am someone who will last. It's a soft identity, not shouted, not announced, but carried the way a person carries perfume, invisible but felt. The palace also has a fondness for containers because containers look like discipline. The pellets are kept in lacquer boxes that click shut with a sound so clean it feels moral. They are kept in jars with sealed lids, labeled in careful handwriting. Sometimes the label is a poem disguised as a description. Sometimes it is simply the name of the regimen, written as if naming it is already half the victory. The lid is opened only at the proper time, as if the pellets themselves might be offended by casual daylight. And because the palace is the palace, there are rules about who touches what. Not everyone is allowed to handle the jar. Not everyone is allowed to measure the powder. The preparation is protected the way the ruler's private chambers are protected by selective access. Access creates importance. Importance creates trust. Trust creates obedience. And obedience creates a world where the method can continue uninterrupted. You can imagine an attendant whose entire role is to be careful with a box. Not a large role, not glamorous, but extremely precise. He might check the seal every day. He might record the number of pellets remaining because the palace loves to record. He might stand very still while holding the container, as if stillness itself preserves potency. His face must be blank because blank faces are also part of the procedure. Somewhere nearby, a scribe might note down the regimen. Not because the ruler will read the notes, rulers rarely have time for their own paperwork, but because writing things down makes them feel real. Writing is a kind of solidity. If it is in the records, it must matter. If it matters, it must be worth continuing. If it is worth continuing, it must be working, at least in some dignified sense. The strangest thing is how quickly the ritual becomes ordinary. It starts as a special practice, a rare intervention, a careful experiment. Then, after enough days, it becomes like brushing one's hair. It becomes part of the nightly settling of the body. The room dims. The cup is placed down. The breath slows. The pellet is taken almost absent-mindedly because the mind is already soothed by the repetition. And repetition is a kind of sleep. This is how the palace turns risk into comfort. It doesn't make the risk smaller, it makes the risk familiar. Familiarity has a magical effect on fear. Familiarity says, you have survived this before. Familiarity says, this is your life now. Familiarity says, do not question too much, because questioning interrupts the pleasant hum of routine. If you want to understand why the sweet medicine is persuasive, You can start by noticing how it fits into existing court habits. The palace already believes in the power of correct forms, correct speech, correct dress, correct posture, correct offerings, correct timing. The elixir regimen simply becomes another correct form, another way to display discipline. A ruler who follows the regimen looks responsible. A court that supports the regimen looks advanced. An official who praises the regimen looks loyal. Even the body's ordinary sensations can be folded into the ritual. A bit of warmth after taking the pellet becomes confirmation. A slight lightness becomes encouragement. A night of deeper sleep becomes evidence. The palace doesn't need dramatic results. Dramatic results would be suspicious. The palace prefers modest improvements that can be described politely and interpreted generously. And if there is no improvement, that can also be interpreted politely. The dosage can be adjusted. The timing can be refined. The ingredients can be purified. The fire can be managed more carefully. The palace always has one more lever to pull, one more detail to tweak. Tweaking is comforting. Tweaking suggests that the outcome is close, like a door that just needs the correct key. There is also something quietly soothing about being told what to do. In a world where the ruler must decide the fate of people, provinces, punishments, rewards, and wars, it can be calming to have a specialist say, "At this hour, take this pellet." It is a rare moment when responsibility is temporarily outsourced to a rule. The rule becomes a little cradle for the mind. The mind can rest inside it for a moment. And because the palace is full of people who are very tired in very hidden ways, that cradle is valuable. The rules expand over time. At first, it is simply take the pellet. Then it becomes take the pellet only after a certain tea. Then it becomes avoid certain foods the day before. Then it becomes adjust the bedding, adjust the breathing, adjust the schedule of audiences so the ruler is not fatigued. The regimen spreads like a vine across the daily routine, wrapping itself around more and more choices until it is hard to say where medicine ends and life begins. This is not an accident. A regimen that touches everything becomes harder to abandon, because abandoning it would mean admitting that your entire day has been built around something uncertain. It would mean admitting that the hours you protected, the foods you avoided, the meetings you rescheduled, the rituals you performed, maybe they did not purchase extra time at all. It is easier emotionally to keep going. The sweetness helps. The sweetness always helps. Sweetness is a small reward for obedience. Sweetness makes discipline feel less like discipline. A tiny pellet that tastes pleasant is a way of saying, you are doing the right thing. The palace is full of bitter realities. It enjoys the idea that longevity can be flavored. And in a court, flavor is never just flavor. Flavor is meaning. Bitter can be virtuous. Sweet can be refined. Gentle can be wise. The sweet medicine borrows the social prestige of sweetness and uses it as a vehicle for the most ambitious desire in the room. The palace also loves the aesthetics of smallness. A huge potion would look like a desperate gulp. A small pellet looks like composure. An increment of immortality taken in a tidy bite looks like confidence. It suggests that the ruler does not need drama. The ruler needs only consistency. And consistency is what the palace always advertises, even when it is privately terrified of change. So the preparation remains neat, the bowls remain clean, the jars remain sealed. The instructions remain formal, the etiquette remains intact. You can imagine the moment of delivery. An attendant approaches with a tray, and the tray is carried as if it holds a fragile relic. The ruler does not reach too quickly. Too quickly would look hungry. The ruler receives the pellet with the calm gesture of someone accepting a compliment. The pellet is placed on the tongue. It dissolves slowly, sweetly. The ruler swallows. Nothing dramatic happens. That is the point. Drama would wake the palace. The palace wants to stay asleep inside the idea that it is managing time. And around the ruler, other elites notice. They notice the regimen, they notice the new rules. They notice the specialist's influence. They notice the way the ruler's private life has acquired new procedure, and procedure is a sign of seriousness. They begin to request their own versions. A prince may have his own jar. A minister may quietly consult someone. A noble household may adopt similar rituals. The idea spreads through the upper layers the way perfume spreads through fabric. What's almost tender in a distant, slightly absurd way is how much care is poured into the process. The pellets are made with attention. The regimen is monitored. The instructions are repeated. There is a sincere desire to do it correctly, to earn the promised result through proper behavior. It's like studying very hard for an exam that may not exist, except the exam is administered by time, and time is famously uninterested in grading fairly. Still, the palace will study. The palace will follow the rules. The palace will keep the jars sealed and the powders measured and the hours respected. It will treat immortality like a craft, something you can practice into existence the way you practice calligraphy into beauty, stroke by stroke, day by day, until the hand believes. And this is the gentle trap of the sweet medicine. It is not only a substance, it is a schedule. It is a posture. It is a way of making fear look like discipline, and discipline look like wisdom. It is a little nightly ceremony that says, softly, you are not declining, you are refining. So the pellets sit in their lacquer box like tiny promises. The box clicks shut with that clean sound again. The room settles. The palace continues to hum. And somewhere, very quietly, the rules become prayer. Because when you cannot command the universe, you learn to repeat the correct words, at the correct hour, with the correct hands. And you hope the repetition itself will be enough to hold the years in place a little longer. At first, it feels like success, which is an excellent way for anything to get invited back. There is warmth, the kind of warmth that feels earned. Not the warmth of a brazier in winter, but the warmth of an internal decision being approved by reality. The ruler wakes and feels slightly more present. The eyes focus a little more easily on ink strokes. The mind, which is usually crowded with petitions, omens, etiquette, and the subtle dread of looking weak in front of the wrong people, seems a touch quieter. Someone notices the complexion looks better, which in palace language can mean anything from less pale to we are trying very hard to be optimistic. So the sweet pellets keep coming because the palace rewards anything that produces even a modest sense of control returning to the body, and that sense of control is deeply seductive. In court life, control is not merely a preference, it is the air. Everything is arranged so that nothing looks accidental. The curtains hang the correct way. The cup is placed the correct way. The words are chosen the correct way. So when the body briefly feels cooperative, the court reads it as confirmation that the method is correct. Confirmation, after all, is what people are paid to find. If you take something called medicine and it immediately makes you feel slightly more alert, the mind begins composing a story without being asked. The story is calm. The story is reasonable. The story says it is working. And once the story exists, it becomes a soft pillow for the court to rest its beliefs on. The first little changes are easy to explain away, which is convenient, because the palace is very talented at explanations. Sleep becomes a little lighter, not necessarily worse, just thinner. You drift off, but you do not sink. The mind floats up the surface of rest like a leaf that refuses to fully commit to the pond. The ruler wakes at odd hours and listens to the palace, breathing distant footsteps. A night guard's quiet call, the faint clink of a lantern chain. The room is still, and yet the body feels like it is quietly holding a meeting. You can imagine it, a ruler in silk, awake beneath embroidered covers, staring at the dark ceiling as if the ceiling might provide instructions. The incense is finished. The lacquer box is closed. The sweet pellet is long gone, and yet the body keeps talking softly in sensations. There's restlessness, the mild kind at first. A leg that wants to move. Fingers that feel slightly too aware of themselves. A small insistence in the chest, as though the heart has decided it would like to be noticed. The palace does not like being noticed by the heart. The heart is meant to do its work quietly, like a good servant. Then there are the small aches that arrive and leave like weather. A dull heaviness in the shoulders, as if the robe has become heavier overnight. A faint throb behind the eyes, which is blamed on reading too much, thinking too much, existing too much. The palace can blame anything on overwork, because overwork is an honorable problem. Overwork is a compliment disguised as a diagnosis. Sometimes there is a tremor so subtle it could be mistaken for cold, a slight shake when lifting a cup, a barely there quiver when holding a brush. It's the kind of thing that, if you mention it openly, makes the room become extremely polite and extremely silent. So it is not mentioned openly. Instead, the ruler's sleeve is adjusted a bit more, as if fabric can hide reality. The mouth becomes dry, which is also an easy symptom to interpret creatively. Dryness can mean heat. Heat can mean activity. Activity can mean transformation. In a palace where transformation is a word people like, dryness becomes almost flattering. It sounds like progress. It sounds like the body is doing something important. And the body is doing something important, yes. Just not necessarily the important thing everyone hopes it is doing. But this is how it goes in the beginning. Discomfort arrives in small, negotiable doses, not as a clear warning, but as a series of strange footnotes. The ruler becomes slightly irritable, which the court carefully avoids calling irritability. Perhaps the ruler is more decisive. Perhaps the ruler is more alert. Perhaps the ruler is less tolerant of inefficiency, which is a very elegant way of saying the ruler is snapping at people for breathing too loudly in the wrong direction. An official reads a memorial, and the ruler's patience runs out halfway through the second paragraph, which is unfortunate for the official but can be recorded as the ruler's standards have sharpened. The palace loves standards. Standards sound virtuous. Irritation sounds human. There may be a pounding in the chest now and then. Not constant, just enough to be memorable. A heartbeat that feels a little too enthusiastic, like a drummer who has had too much tea. The sensation appears during a quiet moment, which is rude. You are sitting calmly, and suddenly the body decides to perform. You place a hand on the chest very lightly, as if asking the heart to lower its voice. It does not always listen. A physician might notice the pulse is wiry or rapid or slippery, which are poetic words for a situation nobody wants to describe plainly. The physician will suggest adjustments. The physician will not say, stop, because stop is a dangerous word. Stop implies that someone made a mistake. Stop implies that the ruler's help is misguided. Stop implies that the specialist's method is questionable. The palace is not designed for the word stop. The palace is designed for the word refine. So, instead of stopping, the court refines. The dosage becomes slightly smaller, then slightly larger again. The timing shifts. The pellet is taken earlier or later. A tea is added to harmonize. A broth is recommended to support the center. Certain foods are removed for a time, then quietly reintroduced. The entire regimen becomes a series of gentle edits, as if you can revise the body the way you revise a document. Here, remove a line there, adjust a phrase, and soon the meaning will improve. This editing process is comforting because it keeps the dream alive without requiring anyone to admit the dream might be flawed. Meanwhile, the symptoms continue to drift in, like a slow fog that does not announce itself. They are not dramatic enough to force a decision. They are just persistent enough to become part of daily life. The ruler's sleep remains strange. Some nights are fine. Some nights are bright, internally bright, as if the mind has lit a lantern and placed it behind the eyes. You lie there, listening to silk shift against silk, noticing how loud silence can be when you are not fully asleep. The palace is full of quiet routines, but insomnia is its own routine, and it is perhaps the most private ritual of all. In the morning, attendants notice the ruler looks tired, and they propose solutions that involve more structure, because structure is the palace's universal medicine. A slightly different morning schedule, a different bathing temperature, a different incense, a different pillow arrangement. The court can rearrange an entire room to avoid admitting that the problem might be in the pellet that the ruler insists on taking. And because the pellet is sweet, it remains emotionally easy to continue. Sweetness is persuasive. Sweetness says, nothing bad is happening, this is comfort. Sweetness also makes the act feel civilized, almost gentle. A bitter draft might invite suspicion. A sweet pellet feels like a treat earned through discipline, like a reward for being the kind of person who takes care of themselves properly. So the ruler keeps swallowing, and the court keeps watching. The watching becomes more elaborate over time. Not openly elaborate, no one wants to make a spectacle of the ruler's fragility, but quietly systematic. A physician records observations with careful language. An attendant notices the ruler's hand trembled slightly when placing down a cup, and the attendant pretends not to notice, which is itself a form of noticing. An official mentions in passing that the ruler seemed especially focused today, which is another polite way of saying something is changing. The palace becomes a place where everyone is monitoring everyone else's reaction to monitoring. There is a gentle absurdity to this, the kind that might make you smile and then forget you smiled. Imagine a court full of highly trained, highly dignified people, all quietly attempting to interpret the ruler's insomnia as proof of spiritual progress. Imagine someone writing with a straight face. That restlessness indicates key moving. Imagine someone nodding solemnly at the phrase, heat leaving, while the ruler stares at a ceiling at 3 a.m, wondering why the heart is behaving like a startled sparrow. But absurdity does not break belief in a palace. Absurdity can be folded into belief, pressed flat and sealed, because the court has a survival instinct. The court survives by aligning itself with whatever the ruler already trusts. If the ruler trusts the sweet medicine, then the sweet medicine becomes politically protected. It becomes part of the ruler's identity. To challenge it is to challenge the ruler's judgment. And challenging the ruler as judgment can be interpreted as challenging the ruler as right to rule. So the court learns to praise whatever must be praised. If the ruler sleeps poorly, perhaps it is transformation. If the ruler is irritable, perhaps it is clarity. If the ruler trembles, perhaps it is energy rising. Every side effect can be turned into a sign, because signs are safer than warnings. Signs make discomfort feel meaningful. Warnings make discomfort feel urgent. The palace does not like urgency. Urgency is disorder. And when the palace cannot admit urgency, the body's messages arrive without being answered properly. The ruler might feel a metallic taste now and then, faint and easy to blame on something else. The tea, the cup, the air, the incense. The palace is full of objects that can take the blame. If your mouth tastes strange, perhaps the water was boiled incorrectly. If your head feels heavy, perhaps the weather is damp. If your limbs feel restless, perhaps you sat too long. There is always a plausible alternative explanation, and the palace uses those explanations the way it uses curtains, to soften harsh light. Still, there are moments when the body's protest becomes harder to decorate. A night comes when the heart pounds enough to make the ruler pause mid-sentence. The ruler stops speaking and everyone in the room becomes perfectly still, because silence is the court's emergency protocol. In that stillness, someone brings a chair, someone offers water, someone suggests a brief rest, and the entire incident is framed as fatigue. Fatigue is safe. Or the ruler becomes unusually forgetful for a moment, just a small slip, the kind that happens to anyone, and the court pretends it did not happen, because pretending preserves dignity. Dignity is more important than accuracy in a palace. Accuracy can be dangerous. Or the ruler wakes with trembling hands and asks quietly whether this is normal. The physician answers carefully, because careful answers are a physician's first medicine. The physician says it is an adjustment. The physician says the body is responding. The physician says the regimen can be refined. No one says, perhaps the dream is flawed, because admitting danger would mean admitting something worse than danger. It would mean admitting that the promise of control was false. It would mean admitting that the method so elegant, so ritualized, so thoroughly woven into daily life might be the very thing unraveling the body. And the palace does not like admitting it has been tricked, especially by its own hope. So the ruler keeps swallowing because stopping would feel like choosing mortality on purpose. That is the key psychology of the slow drift. The symptoms do not arrive as a single catastrophic event that forces a decision. They arrive gradually in a way that allows the mind to remain loyal to the story. The story says, this is part of the process. This is the cost of refinement. This is the body learning a new rhythm. The story says, do not panic. Panicking would be undignified. So the ruler becomes, in a very quiet way, devoted to the regimen. Devotion is easy when the ritual is soothing. The pellet is small. The sweetness is pleasant. The routine is predictable. Even the symptoms, once familiar, become part of the routine's background hum. And that familiarity becomes dangerous, not because it is dramatic, but because it is sleepy. The court's language helps keep everything sleepy. A symptom becomes a sign. A warning becomes an adjustment. A complaint becomes a step on the path. Words turn sharp edges into soft fabric, and the palace wraps itself in that fabric like a blanket. In the evenings, an attendant presents the lacquer box, and the lacquer box clicks open with that clean little sound. The ruler takes the pellet dissolves. The sweetness arrives, and the sweetness says, continue. The room is calm. The lantern is low. The incense thins into silk air. Somewhere outside, a guard turns at the proper hour. Somewhere inside, a heart beats slightly too hard, but not hard enough to break the ritual. Not yet, anyway. And the court does what it has been trained to do. It keeps the ritual intact. It keeps the story intact. It keeps the ruler's hope intact, even as the body begins to speak back more insistently, through insomnia that stretches longer, through irritability that sharpens, through tremors that become harder to hide, through dull aches that do not fully leave. Still, the palace will call it adjustment. The palace will call it progress. The palace will call it anything except what it fears. And the patient keeps swallowing, because in a world built on hierarchy and control, stopping does not feel like caution. Stopping feels like surrender. A headache is not simply a headache. It is a shift. A pounding heart is not simply a pounding heart. It is movement. A dry mouth is not simply dryness. It is heat leaving. Restlessness is not simply the body refusing to sleep. It is transformation, the kind said with a faint approving nod, as if the body is finally behaving like a serious student. This is a neat trick, and it works especially well in rooms full of people who cannot afford to look uncertain, because the palace is an ecosystem of faces. Faces that must remain calm, faces that must remain loyal, faces that must remain convincing. If you are an attendant and you see the ruler rubbing his temples more often, you do not lean forward and say, "That looks concerning." You lean forward and ask whether the lamplight is too bright. You adjust the screen. You suggest a different tea. You offer a quiet solution that keeps everyone's dignity intact. And if you are a physician, the task is even more delicate. You are not only managing symptoms, you are managing meaning. Meaning is dangerous. Meaning can become political. Meaning can become accusation. If you say, the elixir is harming the ruler, you are not just speaking medically. You are stepping on a ladder in public. You are implying that the people who recommended the regimen were wrong. You are implying that the ruler's decision, often made with great ceremony and great investment, might be flawed. And in the palace, the phrase might be flawed can sound suspiciously close to should not be trusted. So instead, discomfort becomes a sign. The palace has always been good at signs. It lives among them, the first cry of a bird at dawn, the unusual color of a cloud, the way a candle flame leans to one side. The court has a habit of interpreting the world as if the world is always speaking in hints. This habit, in some moments, can be poetic and even calming, but it also creates a strange vulnerability. If everything is a hint, then anything can be used as evidence for whatever people already want to believe. When the sweet medicine begins to produce strange symptoms, the palace simply does what it has always done. It interprets. A pounding heart becomes key moving, and that phrase, said slowly, sounds almost reassuring. Key moving sounds like life. It sounds like circulation. It sounds like the inner landscape is clearing itself. It sounds like a blocked canal finally letting water through. You can almost imagine a little internal river, polite and purposeful, flowing toward longevity. A dry mouth becomes heat leaving, which is wonderfully convenient because a dry mouth is uncomfortable but not catastrophic, and heat leaving sounds like progress. Heat is often treated as a problem in court medicine: excess, agitation, internal fire. So if the mouth is dry, perhaps the heat is being drawn out. Perhaps the body is purging something. Perhaps the medicine is doing its work. Restlessness becomes transformation, which is a word that can carry almost any load you place on it. Transformation can be unpleasant. Transformation can be confusing. Transformation can be sleepless, but transformation is noble. Transformation implies improvement. Transformation implies that the suffering is meaningful rather than random. The palace loves meaningful suffering. Meaning makes pain respectable. You can see how the vocabulary becomes a soft blanket thrown over sharp edges. Instead of saying side effect, you say sign. Instead of saying problem, you say process. Instead of saying danger, you say phase. A phase suggests that if you wait, it will pass. Waiting is something the palace is very good at. The palace is built on waiting, and so the court constructs a gentle narrative. The medicine is working, and the body is adjusting. The adjustment is uncomfortable, but that discomfort is proof. Proof that something is happening. Proof that the method has reached deep enough to disturb old patterns. Proof that the ruler is not merely swallowing pellets, but actually changing internally in a way that will eventually produce the promised result. This is persuasive because it offers a world where nothing is wasted, not even suffering, especially not suffering. If you have swallowed the sweet medicine for weeks or months, if you have reorganized your meals and your sleep and your schedule around it, if you have allowed specialists into the private chambers of your hope, then discomfort becomes psychologically expensive to interpret as failure. Failure would mean admitting that time has not been negotiated. Failure would mean admitting you have invested in something that will not pay. So the palace chooses a cheaper interpretation: discomfort is progress. And once that interpretation becomes socially accepted, it begins to work on everyone in the room. Servants learn the new language quickly because servants survive by understanding what language keeps them safe. They learn that when the ruler frowns in the night, they should not look alarmed. They should look attentive. They should say softly that this is common during refinement. They should offer warm water and speak of balance. Physicians hesitate because physicians are trained to notice patterns, and patterns can become frightening. A physician might feel the uncomfortable tug of reality at the edge of his mind, a rapid pulse here, insomnia there, trembling hands, An irritability that is not merely mood, but chemistry. The physician may want to say something direct because directness is what saves lives. But directness is not always what saves careers. So the physician learns to speak in cautious layers. He will recommend observation. He will suggest adjustments. He will phrase concern as refinement. He may propose adding a cooling herb or changing the timing because proposing changes is safer than proposing cessation. Cessation implies that the entire practice is suspect. A change implies the practice is sound but needs customization, like tailoring a robe. The robe metaphor matters. In the palace, everything is tailored. Even truths are tailored. Officials, too, adapt. Officials are often trapped between two fears: fear of being seen as disloyal and fear of being associated with a failure. If they praise the elixir too loudly and it ends badly, they will look foolish. If they question it too openly, they will look disloyal. So they do what the palace teaches them to do. They praise in measured amounts, and they let the language remain flexible. They say things like, His Majesty's vitality seems active. They say, the regimen appears to be producing movement. They say, we observe signs of transformation. These are sentences designed to mean something without meaning too much. There is a quiet comedy in the idea of an entire bureaucracy describing insomnia as spiritual progress. But the palace is a place where comedy can become policy if it keeps the peace. And belief, once it becomes policy, becomes hard to challenge. This is the deeper trap. The poison does not need secrecy when belief does the work of turning warning into reassurance. If you hide a dangerous practice, people will ask why it is hidden. Hidden things attract suspicion. But if you announce a practice with dignity, surround it with ritual, and give it a spiritual vocabulary, then the practice becomes protected by the social instinct to agree. Agreement is not just politeness in a palace. Agreement is survival. So the more the body protests, the more the palace reinterprets the protest as success. This is not because the palace is foolish. It is because the palace is structured to preserve the ruler's confidence. The ruler's confidence is political stability. If the ruler loses confidence, the court trembles. If the court trembles, factions sharpen their knives, usually metaphorical knives, but sometimes not. So stability becomes the highest medicine, even higher than the sweet medicine itself. And stability requires a story that can absorb bad news without breaking. A story that can absorb symptoms is a very useful story. So the story expands. It becomes almost theological. It says the ruler's body is being purified. Old sickness is being driven out. The spirit is becoming lighter. The breath is learning a new pattern. The heart's pounding is the sound of energy moving through pathways that were previously blocked. Blocked pathways are a delightful concept because they suggest that the problem is not the medicine, but the body's previous state. If the ruler feels unwell, it is not because the regimen is harmful. It is because the regimen is finally reaching the true depth of the problem. The more uncomfortable the ruler becomes, the more deeply the medicine must be working. This is, in a very quiet way, the logic of a sunk cost dressed in silk. And the palace, for all its sophistication, is not immune to that logic. In fact, it is especially vulnerable, because the costs are not only material, the costs are social. The costs are symbolic. The costs are bound up in prestige. If the ruler has publicly invested in a method, admitting the method is wrong is not simply admitting an error. It is admitting a weakness. And the palace does not like weakness. Weakness invites opportunists. So belief becomes armor. The ruler's symptoms are padded with interpretation. An irritable mood becomes decisiveness. A tremor becomes energy. A sleepless night becomes spiritual refinement. A dull ache becomes the body reorganizing itself. Even weight loss can be described as the shedding of heaviness. And heaviness is always something the court believes it should shed, morally and physically. At this point, you begin to see how the medicine cabinet becomes a miniature temple. The jars are not only containers, they are reliquaries. The pellets are not only substances, they are tokens of faith. The schedule is not only a schedule, it is devotion. And devotion has a strange relationship with evidence. Devotion does not demand evidence as long as it has meaning. Devotion demands repetition. Devotion demands loyalty. Devotion demands that the discomfort be turned into something bearable. And nothing makes discomfort bearable like the thought that it is purposeful. So, within the palace walls, a subtle etiquette emerges around the symptoms. People learn what to say when the ruler looks pale. People learn what to say when the ruler's hand trembles slightly while lifting a cup. People learn how to react without reacting. They learn to be calm. They learn to provide explanations that keep the ruler's hope polished. They might even begin to anticipate symptoms and prepare interpretations in advance, the way you prepare excuses for weather. If the ruler becomes restless, the physician has a ready phrase: key is moving. If the ruler complains of dryness, the physician has a ready phrase: heat is leaving. If the ruler's sleep is poor, someone can murmur: transformation. These phrases become charms, not because they change the body, but because they change the room. They prevent panic. They prevent doubts from spreading. They keep the ritual intact. And keeping the ritual intact becomes the priority because the ritual has become more than a medical practice. It has become a political instrument of calm. There is another soft detail here. In a palace, nobody wants to be the first to doubt. Doubt is lonely. Doubt separates you from the group. The group is safety. If you doubt and you are wrong, you have insulted the ruler's wisdom for nothing. If you doubt and you are right, you have still created instability, and instability is punishable even when it is accurate. So most people choose the safer route. They interpret alongside everyone else. The result is a slow social hypnosis, not dramatic, not sinister, just very effective. The court repeats the same meanings until the meanings feel like reality. The ruler hears the interpretations and begins to use them too, because language shapes perception. If you are told enough times that your pounding heart is key moving, you might begin to feel proud of your pounding heart, the way you might feel proud of soreness after exercise, because soreness suggests effort. Effort is a flattering frame. And so the body's warnings are repurposed into proof of effort, proof of discipline, proof of progress. The elixir is not harming you. It is challenging you. It is training you. It is refining you, like fire refining metal. Fire is another favorite metaphor, because fire can be dangerous and still be described as necessary. Fire suggests that pain is the cost of purity. Fire suggests that the discomfort is an investment, and investments should not be abandoned mid-process. So the palace keeps the furnace going, metaphorically and sometimes literally, while the ruler's body adjusts in ways the palace does not fully understand. The quiet tragedy is that this reinterpretation delays the moment of honesty. The longer you call symptoms signs, the longer you postpone the possibility that the practice is damaging. But postponement is the palace's specialty. Postponement is what you do with unpleasant truths until they become unavoidable. And for a while, the truth can be postponed quite comfortably because the vocabulary is soothing. The rituals are soothing. The sweetness is soothing. The belief system itself becomes an anesthetic. The poison does not need to hide. It is carried openly, respectfully, as part of a refined regimen. It is protected by the fact that everyone has agreed to see it as refinement rather than risk. This is why belief is such a powerful trap in the palace. It does not operate by force. It operates by convenience. It offers everyone an easier way to interpret what they are seeing. It offers a way to avoid being the bearer of bad news. It offers a way to stay aligned with power. An alignment with power is, in a court, the most reliable medicine of all. So the ruler continues. The symptoms continue. The interpretations continue. The room remains calm. The phrases remain ready. The sweet pellets continue to be swallowed with dignity. And the palace, so elegant, so orderly, continues to turn the bodies, warnings into reassurance, one polished explanation at a time, until the boundary between spiritual signs and physical harm becomes not a line, but a gentle blur as soft as incense thinning into silk air. In a palace, nothing stays merely medical for very long. A cup is a cup, yes, but it is also a signal. A jar is a jar, but it is also a permission slip. A recipe is a recipe, but it is also a small, portable piece of power that can fit inside a sleeve and still rearrange a room. This is the quiet genius of court elixirs. They create a new kind of authority. Whoever controls the method controls the ruler's hope, and hope is a surprisingly useful thing to hold in your hands. At first, it sounds harmless. A specialist arrives. A regimen is proposed. The ruler agrees. The jars are sealed. The pellets are counted. Everything looks tidy, even noble, because it is framed as self-cultivation. But then the practical questions begin, and practical questions are where politics likes to nap, because it can wake up whenever it wants. Where do the ingredients come from? Who is allowed to handle them? Who signs the request forms? Who knows the exact proportions, the timings, the secret step? That must be done quietly, perhaps on an auspicious day, perhaps before anyone has eaten anything too cold. The moment of practice requires rare materials, minerals, herbs, special salts, carefully prepared powders. It grows a supply chain. And a supply chain grows gatekeepers. Gatekeepers grow influence. Influence grows rivals. You can imagine the palace storerooms, cool and dark, lined with boxes and jars like an orderly dream. Labels in neat handwriting. Seals pressed with official calm. Someone opening a drawer and finding something that smells faintly of earth and smoke, and realizing that this smell in this place is political, because procurement is never neutral. If a minister oversees shipments from a distant region, that minister becomes relevant to the ruler's personal routine. If a eunuch manages access to the inner storeroom where the most precious ingredients are kept, that eunuch becomes a kind of living key. If a court faction can claim it, supports the regimen by funding it, managing it, praising it, then that faction can wrap itself around the ruler's private fear and become harder to remove. This is why elixirs create new power. They invent a new reason to be close. Closeness is the most valuable currency in a palace. Not gold, not silk, not even titles, because titles can be granted and then forgotten. Closeness is daily. Closeness is regular. Closeness is seen by everyone, which makes it real. An elixir regimen, by its nature, needs regularity. A pellet before bed, a tea at dawn, a tonic at a certain hour, and anything that repeats becomes a doorway. Whoever walks through that doorway often enough becomes part of the furniture of the ruler's life. So the medicine cabinet becomes a small political arena, like a miniature court inside the larger court. Whoever controls the cabinet controls access to the most private conversation the ruler is having without speaking about time. This is also why secrecy becomes such a carefully managed performance. The recipe must be protected, but not hidden so completely that it looks suspicious. The palace prefers secrecy that looks dignified. Secrecy with ceremony. Secrecy with paperwork. Secrecy that feels like responsibility rather than hiding. So the recipe is written down in a way that only certain eyes can read. Or it is not written down at all, which is even better for the person who wants to remain indispensable. The method is passed orally, which is a polite way of saying it is passed through loyalty. Loyalty is easier to control than ink. If you are the specialist, you want the ruler to believe two things at once. First, that the method is reliable, and second, that the method cannot survive without you. This is a very comfortable arrangement for the specialist. It turns expertise into necessity. If you are a rival at court, you want to loosen that arrangement, not necessarily by proving the method false proving things is messy, but by reshaping who gets credit for it, or by reshaping who gets blamed for its odd effects, or by waiting quietly until the regimen becomes inconvenient, and then appearing with an alternative that sounds safer, older, more orthodox, more aligned with whatever language the ruler currently finds reassuring. This is why the medicine cabinet becomes political. It offers many soft levers to pull. You can flatter the practice. That is the simplest lever. Praise costs very little and can buy proximity. You praise the regimen as wise. You praise the ruler as disciplined. You praise the specialists as learned. You praise the method as evidence that the dynasty is advanced. You create an atmosphere where supporting the elixir sounds like supporting stability itself. In a palace, stability is a word you can use to justify almost anything, especially if you say it softly. Or you can sabotage the practice without openly challenging it, which is another lever and a more interesting one because it fits the palace's taste for indirect action. If you cannot oppose the regimen, you can make it difficult. You can delay shipments. You can misplace a rare ingredient. You can ensure the best materials go somewhere else first, quietly, the way water finds the easiest path. You can appoint a less competent attendant to handle the jars. You can introduce small errors into the routine, not enough to be obvious, just enough to make outcomes less predictable. Unpredictability is a very effective weapon against a practice that depends on belief, because belief likes clean patterns. Belief likes to point to a good morning and say, see? If you disrupt the pattern, you weaken the story, and stories are the real medicine in the palace. Or you can simply wait. Waiting is underrated, but the palace is built on it. It is the great art of doing nothing in a way that looks strategic. If a rival believes the sweet medicine is harmful, the rival does not necessarily need to intervene. The rival can smile, politely nod, and allow the ruler's body to continue weakening under treatment, while the rival keeps their own hands clean. Clean hands matter, and court politics, in a sense, is not about truth. It is about appearance, and appearance is often maintained through patience. Of course, not everyone waiting is a villain. Some people wait because they are afraid. An honest advisor may notice something is wrong. The advisor may see the tremor, the sleeplessness, the irritability, the gradual thinning of vitality. But the advisor also knows that challenging the elixir is like challenging the ruler's right to hope. And hope in a palace is not an individual emotion. It is a public property. If the ruler has publicly aligned with the regimen, then the regimen becomes a symbol of the ruler's judgment. Symbols are dangerous to touch. If you touch them, you leave fingerprints. Fingerprints become accusations. So even honest advisors hesitate. They weigh their words as carefully as the powders in the jars. They might suggest rest. They might suggest moderation. They might suggest returning to simpler medicines, which is a gentle way of implying that complicated ones might be risky. They might cite tradition because tradition is safer than criticism. They might quote old texts that praise balance because balance can sound like support even when it is worrying. But the advisor will avoid saying plainly, stop taking the sweet medicine, unless the advisor is either extremely brave or extremely tired. Most advisors choose the palace's safer vocabulary. They recommend adjustments, not endings. They recommend observation, not reversal. They recommend refinement because refinement sounds loyal. This is how the cabinet becomes a political object. It trains everyone to speak around it. The specialists, too, must manage politics, not just chemistry. If the ruler's condition worsens, the specialist cannot simply admit. This is harm because admitting harm would collapse the specialist's position. The specialist needs interpretations. The specialist needs plausible explanations that keep the regimen alive. So the specialist may say the symptoms are signs of deep transformation. Or the specialist may blame impurities in ingredients, which conveniently shifts attention to the supply chain, meaning to whoever oversees procurement. This is a subtle but powerful move. If the elixir fails, someone must be responsible. Better that responsibility lands on the people who handle materials, not on the person who invented the method. And the palace, which loves shifting responsibility like a silkscreen move to block a draft, cooperates. If a certain batch of pellets seems to produce worse symptoms, that batch can be blamed on the inferior ingredients. If a ruler complains of strange sensations, the sensations can be blamed on the season, the weather, a recent stress, a ceremonial obligation, anything that keeps the method pure in theory. Purity in theory is often all a court practice needs to survive. Meanwhile, control of the cabinet becomes a way to reward allies. If you are loyal, you might be allowed to oversee the regimen. If you are not, you might be kept away from it. Access becomes a badge. The person who carries the lacquer box becomes important not because the box is heavy, but because the box is meaningful. It's almost funny, in a gentle way, to imagine a palace where the route of a small box through corridors becomes a map of political trust. Who walks closest behind it? Who is allowed to touch the seal? Who is allowed to stand in the doorway during preparation? These are tiny privileges, and tiny privileges are the palace's favorite kind because they can be granted and removed without a formal announcement. A formal announcement would create drama. The palace prefers quiet power. Even the language around the elixir becomes factional. Supporters describe it as cultivation, wisdom, heaven's method. Skeptics, if they dare to speak, may call it excess, dangerous heat, over-refining, phrases that sound medical but carry moral weight. One side frames the regimen as progress. The other frames it as indulgence disguised as discipline. And because the palace is always choosing which moral story to inhabit, the elixir becomes a moral object as much as a medical one. There's also a softer layer of politics, the politics of appearing modern, advanced, enlightened. A court that employs alchemists can present itself as sophisticated, as daring, as connected to hidden knowledge. This looks impressive. It makes the ruler look like a patron of learning, a collector not only of art, but of methods that touch the boundary between human and divine. Courts like to compete in such things. Not openly, perhaps, but silently, the way neighbors compete by having slightly cleaner doorsteps. A rival court hears rumors. This ruler has a remarkable regimen. This dynasty has rare pills. This palace has specialists who can extend years. Rumors travel. Prestige travels with them. And once prestige is involved, it becomes harder to admit that something might be dangerous. Prestige does not like to apologize. So the practice continues, partly because of belief and partly because of politics. The cabinet is protected not because it is true, but because it is convenient. Convenient for specialists who become indispensable. Convenient for factions who gain access. Convenient for officials who can praise the ruler's discipline. Convenient for advisors who prefer caution to confrontation. Convenient for rivals who can wait. And the ruler at the center of this soft web continues to swallow pellets that taste sweet and feel refined, while everyone around the ruler rearranges their own positions relative to the cabinet, as if the cabinet were a small moon and the court were politely orbiting it. If you listen long enough in a quiet room, you can almost hear how much of palace life is like that. Small objects carrying large meanings, small routines becoming large power structures, small jars holding not only powders but ambitions. The lacquer box clicks shut again. The seal remains unbroken. The notes are filed. The attendants glide away. The cabinet stays in its place, calm and ordinary, as if it is only a piece of furniture. And in the palace, that is often exactly how the most powerful things prefer to look. The palace does not notice everything at once. The palace notices slowly, the way a person notices that a room has grown colder only after sitting still for a long time. At first, each case feels isolated. One ruler grows irritable. Another ruler becomes fragile. A prince fades early. A minister brilliant, energetic, constantly present, suddenly becomes thin and tired and strangely absent in the eyes. A court physician writes careful notes. A court historian records events with polite distance. And the palace keeps moving, because the palace always keeps moving. But then, after enough seasons, something begins to repeat often enough that even the palace, as love of explanation, starts to feel stretched. It's not one dramatic collapse. It's an accumulation, a small pile of similar endings. A handful of brilliant men fading early. A handful of rulers growing unpredictable and fragile. A handful of nights that become more restless than restful. A handful of illnesses that do not behave like ordinary illness. The palace begins to recognize the shape of it, and recognition is a strange kind of alarm, silent but decisive. You can imagine how it happens, not in one meeting, not as a loud announcement, more like a murmured exchange between physicians who have learned to speak carefully in corridors. A glance at an old notebook, a comparison of pulse descriptions, a sentence that begins as, "I have noticed," and ends as, "Perhaps we should observe more closely, because direct conclusions are dangerous." Someone in the inner medical office lays out records like quiet evidence, dates, symptoms, the times when certain regimens began, the times when the ruler's sleep changed, the times when irritability sharpened, the times when trembling hands appeared, the times when the court added more adjustments, more herbs, more teas, more rules, without ever removing the central sweet promise. If you were watching from a distance, it might look like bureaucracy doing what bureaucracy does best, collecting paper until paper begins to look like truth. And it does begin to look like truth. The pattern is not subtle anymore. Too many men with access to the same kind of sweet regimen end up with the same kinds of problems. Too many bodies react in the same slow way. Too many minds become restless. Too many hearts pound. Too many rulers become both more intense and less stable, an unfortunate combination for anyone in charge of an empire. The palace has a particular dread of unpredictability. Weakness is one thing. Weakness can be managed with caretakers, schedules, and polite explanations. Unpredictability is worse because unpredictability makes officials nervous, factions ambitious, and everyone's sense of safety thin. A fragile ruler is a tragedy. An unpredictable ruler is a political problem. So when the palace notices rulers becoming unpredictable under treatment, the pattern begins to matter in a new way. It becomes not merely a private medical concern, but a threat to stability. Stability is the palace's true immortality. If stability cracks, everything else becomes urgent. At first, the court tries the usual strategy. It reinterprets. It blames the season. It blames stress. It blames impurities. It blames the wrong specialist. It blames a rival faction's interference. It blames anything that allows the practice to remain intact in theory, but patterns are stubborn. Patterns resist decorative language. Eventually, a few dynasties begin to distrust the furnace. Not openly, not publicly, not with a grand denunciation, because grand denunciations create embarrassment, and embarrassment is politically expensive. Instead, distrust appears as a subtle shift in taste, a quieter preference for simpler medicines, a renewed respect for gentler regimens, a return to broths, sleep, moderation, and the kind of advice that sounds boring enough to be safe. A physician might recommend fewer potent substances and more rest. An advisor might quote an old text about moderation with the careful implication that the ruler's pursuit has become too intense. An official might sponsor more orthodox medical approaches, the ones that do not involve furnaces and minerals and the promise of altering reality. The palace likes orthodoxy when it feels threatened. Orthodoxy is a safe robe to wear when experiments begin to look expensive, so you see small changes in daily practice. The jars are still there, but perhaps they are open less often. The palettes are still praised, but perhaps with slightly less enthusiasm. The specialist is still respected, but perhaps consulted with slightly more distance. The court's language begins to shift from transformation back toward balance, because balance is a more cautious word. Balance suggests maintaining rather than pushing, and yet the desire remains, because it was never only about health. It was about fear wearing gold. The fear is simple. The ruler does not want to be replaced by the next ruler. The minister does not want to be replaced by the next minister. The prince does not want to become a footnote in someone else's reign. Everyone in the palace is surrounded by proof that power changes hands. The palace itself is built from layers of previous lives. It is full of names that once mattered and now exist as ink on bamboo, as carved characters on stone, as polite references in histories. The elite understand history more intimately than most because they are the ones who write it and the ones who get written into it. They know that immortality in the literal sense may be impossible, but immortality in the symbolic sense, lasting influence, lasting status, lasting memory feels almost reachable. The sweet medicine offers both. It promises more days, which means more decisions, more influence, more time to shape the story. It promises that you can remain the main character a little longer. So even when the palace begins to notice the pattern, it does not simply stop. It hesitates. It adjusts. It filters. It seeks new specialists who claim they can keep the promise without the unpleasant consequences. It tries to separate the bright dream from the dark drift, as if the dream is pure and only the execution was flawed. This is a very human effort to salvage hope by changing the packaging. And you can see it in how courts treat the memory of the sweet poison once the pattern becomes undeniable. They do not celebrate it. They do not boast about it. They let it become a caution that survives in stories, notes, and embarrassed silence. Embarrassment is important here. The palace does not like admitting it was fooled, especially not by something it wanted to believe. If the sweet medicine harmed rulers, then the palace's own desire for forever becomes part of the harm. That is not a comfortable thought to hold. So the palace stores the lesson in a quiet place, like a jar placed on a high shelf, visible if you know where to look, ignored if you don't. Court historians might record the decline with careful understatement. His Majesty's health weakened, his temperament changed. Certain practices were discontinued. The language remains polite, as if politeness can soften tragedy. Physicians might pass warnings to their students with hushed seriousness. Do not over-refine. Do not trust sweetness. Do not confuse ritual for safety. Their warnings might be wrapped in metaphor, because metaphor is safer than accusation. They might say, beware the medicine that feels too elegant, beware the method that promises to outrun the seasons. Beware the furnace that turns longings into ash. And then the palace continues because the palace must continue. A new ruler arrives. New advisors arrange themselves. New specialists offer new methods. The same fear wearing new robes walks the same corridors. The same incense burns. The same lacquer boxes click shut. The same quiet voices offer the same soft persuasion. You can last. But now, somewhere in the back of the palace mind, there is the pattern. The pattern sits there like a shadow that does not move much. It does not shout. It simply exists. It reminds a few cautious people that bright promises can have quiet endings, and that when something is called sweet, you should perhaps ask very gently what the sweetness is covering up. The palace notices, at last, not in a single moment, but in a slow dawning, too many similar stories, too many similar symptoms, too many similar disappointments. And once a palace notices a pattern, it cannot fully unsee it. It can only decide how politely to live with what it has learned. Imagine a late night in the palace when everything important has already happened and nothing important is allowed to happen again until morning. The corridors have thinned out. The busy layers of sound, the day's footsteps, the rustle of official robes, the careful coughs before someone speaks, have dissolved into the soft leftovers of night. Somewhere far away, a guard shifts his weight and the faintest metal clinks, a sound so small it feels like it belongs to the building itself. The ruler's room is quiet in the particular way quiet becomes when it is supervised. Even silence in a palace has rules. The lamps are turned low, not extinguished, because darkness can feel too honest. The air is warm enough to be gentle. A screen filters the light into a shape that looks calm on purpose. The bed is arranged as if arrangement can protect you. Clean fabric, smooth edges, embroidery that tells you, without words, that this place is meant to be safe. On a small table sits the lacquer box. It is not a dramatic object. It is elegant, which is worse. Elegance makes things easier to accept. The box is polished, dark, and patient. It clicks shut with that tidy sound the palace likes, a sound that suggests the world is still under control, still sealed properly. Next to it is a cup, perhaps jade, perhaps porcelain, perhaps something that feels cool even in warm air. The cup has been placed carefully, because careful placement is what the palace does when it does not know how to control time. The cup makes no sound on wood, as if it has learned to be polite. Even objects become polite here, and there's the pill. Small enough to seem harmless, smooth enough to seem refined, sweet enough to make the whole act feel like discipline rather than desperation. It sits there as if it is simply another nightly custom, like washing hands, like smoothing hair, like reciting an evening phrase before sleep. The ruler looks at it the way a tired person looks at something that has become both comfort and burden, because by now the palace has noticed things. Not loudly, not publicly, but the noticing has entered the air. The furnace is trusted less. The physicians speak with slightly more caution. The advisors offer simpler suggestions. The rituals around the sweet medicine remain, but they have acquired a faint shadow, like an ink wash that darkens the edge of a painting. The ruler, though, still has the desire. That desire has not faded simply because people have become embarrassed. Desire does not care about embarrassment. Desire cares about fear, and the fear is that the bright promise, so bright it once felt like dawn, has begun to look like a quiet ending. So, in this late-night room, the ruler hesitates. The pill is untouched. The cup is set down. The room is breathing softly, as if the palace itself is asleep, and the ruler is the only waking part of it. The lamp light shifts slightly with the draft. The ruler's hands rest on the covers, and the hands look human in a way hands rarely look in public. This is the part nobody sees. This is the part where a ruler is not a symbol, not a policy, not a face that must remain calm. Just a body that must eventually do what all bodies do, whether they are dressed in silk or not. Outside, the night continues with slow discipline. The guards keep their timing. The lanterns keep their glow. The courtyards keep their stillness. A distant door closes softly and does not echo much because the palace knows how to swallow sound. Inside, the ruler's attention returns again to the little pill, because small things are sometimes the hardest things to decide. It would be easy to swallow it. Swallowing would maintain the story. Swallowing would keep the ritual intact. Swallowing would allow the palace to remain asleep inside its comforting vocabulary refinement, transformation, key moving, hate leaving. Swallowing would mean nothing changes, and the palace prefers nothing changing. But the pill now is not merely medicine. It is a question about what steadies you, a question about what dazzles you, a question about whether the chase for forever has been quietly costing you the only life you actually have. The ruler does not speak this question aloud, because the palace does not like questions that sound like doubt. Doubt is dangerous. Doubt spreads. Doubt creates new politics. So the question stays inside the room, inside the ruler's chest, Inside the way, the eyes linger on the pill a little longer than usual. This is where the bedtime oath begins, not as a declaration to others, but as something private and soft. An oath does not need to be loud. An oath can be a small decision made in a small moment. An oath can be made with a breath. The ruler might think of the years behind, all the mornings measured in rituals, morning audiences, sealed memorials, footsteps counted on stone. The palace so orderly, so devoted to schedules and correct forms. The palace so certain it can manage everything if it only manages carefully enough. And then the ruler might think of the quiet truth that even emperors leave. Not because they were incompetent, not because they were unlucky, simply because that is how time behaves. This thought is not comfortable, but comfort is not always the point of an oath. Sometimes an oath is a way of choosing a different kind of comfort, the kind that comes from not pretending. The lamplight glows steadily as if it has no opinion. The cup remains where it is. The pill remains on the table like a small, sweet dare. The ruler's breathing slows. The room feels even more still, as if the palace is holding its own breath out of respect for the moment. In this stillness, you can imagine the ruler letting the lesson be gentle, not a sharp condemnation, not a dramatic renunciation, just a quiet recognition that chasing forever can cost the only life you actually have, that a promise can be bright and still be dangerous, that sweetness can be a disguise, that the body, when it complains, is not always being dramatic or spiritual. Sometimes it is simply telling the truth in the only language it has. And perhaps, in this moment, the ruler makes an oath that sounds like a simple thing, but is actually quite rare in a palace, to choose what steadies, not what dazzles. Steadies can be boring. Steadies can be sleep. Steadies can be broth and warmth and moderate routines and physicians who speak plainly. Steadies can be a room that is calm without being manipulated. Steadies can be accepting the ordinary rhythm of being human, even when you have spent your entire life being treated as more than human. Dazzles, on the other hand, is always a performance. Dazzles is a furnace glow in the mind. Dazzles is the idea that you can purchase a longer life with the right recipe. Dazzles is an elite fantasy dressed as wisdom. The palace loves dazzles. That is why it must sometimes be reminded gently to choose steady. So the pill remains untouched for a while longer. Maybe it is taken, maybe it is not. The story does not need a dramatic answer to be meaningful. The meaning is in the pause. The meaning is in the fact that the ruler can imagine not swallowing. The meaning is in the quiet moment where time is allowed to be what it is, rather than what someone promised it could become. Somewhere outside the room, a guard calls an hour softly. The sound is carried away by stone and night air. It feels distant, as if the world itself is speaking in whispers now. Inside, the lacquer box sits with its polished calm, waiting to be closed, because closure is also a kind of comfort. The ruler reaches for the box, slowly, not hurriedly. The fingers touch the lid. The lid lowers. The click is clean, and that clean sound can mean many things. It can mean the regimen continues. It can mean the regimen pauses. It can mean the palace remains the palace. It can mean the palace has learned something. The incense fades. The room's edges soften. The lamplight becomes a warm blur behind the screen, and time for once is allowed to move. Not raced, not negotiated, not tricked. Just allowed. The bed holds the ruler, the way a bed holds anyone, quietly, without ambition. The palace settles around its sleeping center. The corridors remain still. The jars remain sealed. The notes remain filed. The stories remain, tucked into drawers and memories, and the embarrassed silence of people who once wanted forever. And the night continues in its calm, repetitive way, as if it could continue forever. 2 soft footsteps, low lanterns, slow breaths, until the only thing left to do is nothing at all, and that nothing is finally gentle enough to feel like rest.